Okay, so I want to talk about Lucretius's more subtle arguments that death isn't bad. He throws these out. He doesn't really develop them, but they're interesting, and I think they deserve to be developed because they are pretty powerful arguments for his conclusion, right? Seems like, the other one, the more standard Epicurean argument doesn't work. It ignores this possibility, well, we can be harmed not just by something positively bad, but also by being deprived of something good. These arguments are more subtle. They don't work just by ignoring that possibility. So, two more subtle arguments that death doesn't harm us. The symmetry argument and the not around to be harmed argument. Symmetry argument toward the end of the reading, Lucretius says, well, you're not, think of all the time that passed before you were born. You didn't exist then. You don't mourn that. Well, how's that any different from all the time after you die that you're not going to exist? The not around to be harmed argument. Well, look, if you cease to exist at death, how can it harm you, right? If I am put in a coma for 20 years and wake up, we can say that I'm harmed because during that 20 years I missed out on all this experience. But if I just don't exist, how can I be harmed since I'm not there to be harmed, right? Non-existent things seem like they can't be harmed, right? Think about fictional characters, right? You can't really harm Superman because he doesn't exist. He's also invulnerable and all that stuff, but also he doesn't exist, right? Well, at some point you do exist, but after you die you don't. So aren't you in this category like fictional characters? You can't be harmed anymore because you don't exist. I'll warn you guys now, questions about existence and non-existence they get super complicated really quick. I'll try not to get too far into the weeds when we get into that, but just be aware they do get complicated pretty quickly. We'll talk more about that argument in the next lecture, but in this one I want to talk about the symmetry argument. Now I keep calling Epicurus Lucretius. They're different guys even though they follow the same philosophy, right? Lucretius doesn't really develop his symmetry argument as well as I would like, but it is an interesting argument, so I think we should draw it out, we should develop it, and put it in this distilled, numbered premises and conclusion form. So, the symmetry argument. Suppose death harms us by depriving us of future experience. If that is so, we are also harmed by all the experiences we were deprived of by not existing earlier. Right? The thought is, you die on, December 31st, 2092. Let's make it a nice, long life. Well, you were deprived by all that stuff you missed by not being alive in 2093, 2094, 2095, 2096, and so on, right? Well, Lucretius says, think about whenever your birthday is, right? We'll just go with mine, right? March 18th, 1979, right? Well, look, whenever I'm going to die, probably not going to be as late as 2090. I would be very, very, very old by then. Right? But when I'm going to die, I might say whenever that is, I'm going to be thinking I'm missing stuff deprived because I'm not going to be around after that, right? Well, Lucretius would say, well, you're not upset about the stuff you missed not being born in 1978, are you? No, that's silly. Now, here, 1978 was kind of a not great time to be alive. But beyond that, even if it had been a wonderful time, 77, you're not upset about missing 77, are you? I'm like, well, no. 76, 75, 74, we go all the way back, 1950, 19 whatever. And I'd say, well, no, I'm not upset about missing all that. And he's like, well, look, what's the difference? You're not around in the future, and you're upset about not being around in the future to experience this stuff, but you weren't around in the past to experience it, and you're not upset about that. What is the difference? Why treat these two things differently, huh? So, it is absurd. Most of us wouldn't think that we are harmed by missing out on experiences we were deprived of by not being born earlier. You don't think that, right? Lucretius would say to me, well, if you don't think that, death cannot harm us by depriving us of future experience. This idea that death harms us by depriving us of future experience gets us to this absurd conclusion that we are harmed by experiences we didn't have by not being born sooner, by not existing sooner. That's crazy. None of us think that. So we should reject this idea that we are harmed by not being around after we die, by missing experiences. This is Lucretius running his own reductio argument against those of us who say that death does harm us. We'll come back to this. I want to, in this lecture we'll talk about where this might go wrong, but I want to put the other argument on the table, even though we're not going to get to it until next lecture. Not around to be harmed argument. Anything that harms us must occur at a specific point in our lives. If death is the end of all existence, then nothing that harms us could happen after we die. But being deprived of future experiences harmed by death happens after we die, so death cannot harm us by depriving us of future experience, right? How can you be harmed if you're not there anymore? If you were alive, yes, again, depriving you of experience would harm you. Maybe. But if you're not there, that's the difference between being in a coma and missing experience. Poor Rip Van Winkle and missing 50 years of experience. And the dead person isn't there to be harmed. All right. This one I'm going to shelve until the next lecture because I do think it's complicated. There's something I think off about this argument, but it's a little harder to see what it is. Let's talk about Nagel's criticism of the symmetry argument first. The symmetry argument seems pretty powerful. Why isn't Nagel convinced? Well, Nagel will say this, look, it's possible to live longer. Think of all the advances in medical science. A lot of people who didn't live but to 50 or 60 50, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, could now live to 80 because of new medicine, right? It is possible to live longer. It's not possible, Nagel will say, to have existed sooner than we did. You could maybe have been born a bit earlier than you were, but is that, that's not really existing sooner. That's just, being born, right? You existed before that. You just changed, we're in a different place, right? Your mother's womb. So really not possible for us to have existed sooner than we do. Nagel will say that's why it doesn't make sense to limit not being born sooner. That's just not possible. Living longer is possible. Now, Nagel needs to say a bit more about this, right? Because I think we might say to Nagel, well, what do you mean by possible, right? In a very real sense, it doesn't seem to be possible that we live all that much longer, right? If we're 30 or 40 and hit by a bus or something, then yeah, we could have lived longer. Let's not get hit by that bus. But, current state of medical science, most of us really can't live too much past 80, right? There are some people with really good genes who do seem just naturally to live very long. Even with them, it's not possible to live very much longer, current state of medical science, than about 100, right? As far as I know, no human being has lived really much past 120. That seems what we know now to be the upper limit. The oldest that we've verified any human has ever lived, this woman Jeanne Calment in France. My French is terrible. I'm sure I'm just butchering the pronunciation of her name, right? But doesn't matter. You can look her up. She lived to be 122. And the current thought is that you know, Madame Calment probably had something in her genes that let her live that long. She aged really well. Even to her early hundreds, she was pretty active. But she seems to be like the upper limit, right? Very few people live that long, and nobody lives longer than that. It just doesn't seem possible, right? With the current medical science, 80, maybe about 120 if you're super, super lucky. Not possible to live much longer than that. So you might say to Nagel, what do you mean by possible, right? Nagel's, though, he's pretty extreme. He says, well, even a death at 800 might be bad, right? Well, that just seems like, what do you mean by possible here, Nagel, right? Because it's not just that, current medical science is impossible. I don't know that it will ever be possible to live that long. I mean, who knows, but not possible now, doesn't know if it will ever be possible. So what do you, Nagel, mean it's possible to live longer, not possible to be born sooner? Don't they both seem like equally impossible, at least given the current state of medical science? So, tell me, Nagel, how it is not possible to have been born sooner, but it is possible to live longer. Well, possible is a tricky term, right? But I think Nagel would say and should say, if pressed, there's a difference between physical impossibility and conceptual impossibility. At the moment, it is physically impossible to live too much past 80 for most people. It is physically impossible to live much past 120 for, as far as I know, everybody right now. It is very probably physically impossible for, always to live to 8,000, right? But Nagel would say it is conceptually possible. You can coherently imagine it. You can imagine somebody who has even better genes than Madame Calment. People have talked about doing genetic engineering like this, who lives to 200, right? You can imagine super duper great medical technology, even though we don't have it, that might allow the rest of us to live way longer than we do. Just replace parts when they break, right? One of those pills like they have in sci-fi stories that slows or even reverses your aging. You can imagine that. Not physically possible right now, but you can imagine it. Think of another thing, right? If you guys know any physics, it is, as far as we know, physically impossible to travel faster than light. Given what we know now, science is always evolving, but it seems that the speed of light is the absolute speed limit for the universe. But you can coherently imagine people traveling faster than light. Tune in Star Trek sometime, right? Some problems with Star Trek predicting the future, but we can at least imagine this thing that, for all we know, might always be physically impossible, traveling faster than light. Nagel says if you think about it, though, you cannot even coherently imagine existing sooner than you do. Well, why not? Well, think about this. If your parents had even conceived you sooner than they actually did, it would have been a different sperm and almost certainly a different egg as well. If your parents had had a baby 1 month before, conceived a baby 1 month before they conceived you, that would not be you. It would be your sister or brother, right? Different DNA, not you. It would just be a sibling. If they had done that, you wouldn't exist, but this sister or brother would exist. Push it further, though, right? How could you, definitely how could you exist before your parents existed, right? They have to give you the DNA, right? There's no way, if my parents had had a baby sooner, say 1978, that person wouldn't be me, right? So it doesn't seem like I could have been born in 1978. But definitely I couldn't have been born in 1908, right? Neither of my parents existed yet. How could I get my DNA from people who don't exist? That just seems impossible, right? And go a step further. Even if somehow miraculously someone with your exact DNA came to exist far in the past, 1908, say somehow this person who has exactly my DNA pops into being in 1908, right? Would that person be you? I mean, good reason to think they wouldn't be, right? You are shaped by your culture, language, and environment. If somehow someone with your genetic code miraculously existed in 1908, they would just somehow be some weird identical twin who lived years before you did. Not you, right? So I think Nagel's right. When you really think about this, there's a conceptual impossibility in us existing sooner. When you really think it through, it's like a triangle with 4 sides or a square circle, right? It might seem like it's not contradictory. We might imagine some way, you get these weirdos who go to, well, they're not that weird, right? I mean, but I wouldn't want to spend my Saturday going to a Renaissance fair. You get these people who go to Renaissance fairs like, oh, would that I lived in the Middle Ages, right? I only want to spend my Saturdays in good, normal ways, like, going to a Star Trek convention, right? That's not weird at all, right? People who go to Renaissance fairs, that's weird. I'm being very ironic here, right? But anyway, I find it weird to want to exist in the Middle Ages, not just because medieval times seem like pretty bad times, but also because you couldn't have existed in the Middle Ages, right? So even though people might think they want this, if you think it through, it just doesn't seem possible. That's what seems to be wrong with the symmetry argument. Now look, we'll come back to this because we still need to, I think, to see if this is really wrong or right, we need to get into these tricky questions about personal identity, just what makes us us. On some views of personal identity, maybe we could have existed sooner, but for all we know, there does seem to be a sort of impossibility here that there's not when it comes to living longer. It might be physically impossible for us to ever have a wonder drug that magically reverses aging when we take it, but Nagel will say we can consistently, coherently imagine that in a way that it doesn't seem we can imagine existing sooner. That is where the symmetry argument breaks down. All right, so for the next lecture, we'll get into this not around to be harmed argument.